I have kept a tally book for 31 years. Head of cattle, inches of rain, the day a man was born and the day he wasn't anymore. Numbers don't lie, and they don't feel sorry for you either, which is why I trust them more than most people. But there's no column in my book for what I saw the morning the eastbound let off a woman near 6 feet tall, standing on that platform with her chin tucked down like she was trying to fold herself into something smaller. I had seen brides come off that train before. I had seen them sent back on the same one an hour later, cheeks burning, while a man muttered that she wasn't what the letter promised. So I stood there with the wagon, already knowing how it would end. I was wrong, and I have spent every year since trying to write down exactly how wrong a bitter old man can be. This is the story of a woman who came west expecting to be turned away one more time, and the crippled cowboy who looked up at her, all the way up, and smiled like the sun had finally decided to rise. Stay with me, it doesn't go the way you think. Nothing worth telling ever does. The train came in loud and left quiet, the way trains do, and in the space between I watched a woman decide whether to step down or die where she stood. I could see the deciding on her face. She had one gloved hand on the rail and one boot already reaching for the platform, and she wasn't moving. Behind her, the porter waited with a carpet bag and a hat box, too polite to nudge. In front of her was Wilcox, or the little sun-blistered edge of it that served as a depot, and me, Josiah Wren, holding the reins of Wes Cade's wagon and wishing I was anywhere else in the territory. I'd driven in alone. That was the first mistake, and it was mine, though I'd argue about whose it truly was until my dying day. Wes had said he'd come. Then that morning a heifer got herself cast in a wash with her calf half-born, and by the time we'd hauled her upright and slicked the calf out into the world, the sun was already mean and the train was already whistling somewhere past the dragoons. "Go on ahead," Wes told me, up to his elbows in birth blood and grinning like a fool at that wet calf. "I'll wash and follow, don't let her sit in the heat." So I went, and now here was the heat, and here was her, and no groom in sight. She stepped down. I want to tell you she did it gracefully, but grace is not the word. She did it the way a person walks into cold water all at once before the nerve fails. Her boots hit the boards and she straightened, and then she kept straightening, and Lord, she just kept going up. Tall as a young cottonwood. Taller than me by a hand, and I am not a short man. Her dress was gray, plain, brushed and rebrushed until the nap had worn thin at the cuffs. Her hat sat level. Her eyes came up last, and when they found me, an old sunburnt stranger by a wagon, no young man, no flowers, nobody who looked like the beginning of a life. I watched something behind them simply close, like a shopkeeper drawing the shade at dusk. "You'll be Mr. Wren," she said, not a question. Her voice was low and even, a voice that had practiced not shaking. "Adelaide Voss, though I suppose it doesn't matter now." "Ma'am," I touched my hat. "We's Mr. Cade, he had a cow go bad on him this morning. He's coming directly." She nodded slow, and I saw she didn't believe a word of it. Why would she? She had heard prettier lies than that, no doubt, and each one had cost her the whole way across a country. I understood then, standing in the dust, that this woman had already lived the ending of this story twice before, and both times it ended with her back on a train, folded small. Let me tell you what I knew about her, which was little. Wes had answered a notice in a matrimonial paper 8 months back. I thought him a damned fool for it and told him so over supper, and he just laughed and said a man with a bad leg and a good ranch and no gift for talking to women had to fish where the fish were. They'd written letters. I'd seen him hunched over the lamp of an evening, tongue between his teeth, copying a line out 3 times to get it right. I hadn't read them. A man's letters are his own. But I'd seen him wait for the mail like a boy waits for Christmas, and I'd seen the days he came back empty-handed and how they sat on him. What I did not know, what I'd learn later in pieces, the way you learn everything true about a person, was that Adelaide Voss had sent Wes a photograph taken sitting down. She'd chosen a high-backed chair and a careful pose, and she'd told him in the letter in her small, honest hand that she was taller than most, and I'll not pretend otherwise, though a picture is a poor way to say it. She'd told him. She'd made herself write it, the very thing that had ruined her twice, because she'd decided she was done being sent back for a truth she could have spoken plainly. And Wes had written back 3 words that she carried the whole way west, folded into the lining of her glove. I didn't know any of that yet. I only knew she was standing there waiting to be told, in some kind or unkind way, that she'd come 2,000 miles for nothing. "We'll load your things," I said, because it was all I had. "There's water in the jug under the seat. It's warm, but it's wet." She helped me load. That surprised me. Most brides stood aside and let a man sweat. She swung her own trunk up onto the bed before I could get a proper hold of it, and when she saw my face, she flushed and set it down too hard. "Sorry," she said, and then quieter, bitter as green pecan. "I forget myself. I'm told I ought to." I didn't answer that. I didn't have the words. I have never had the words at the right time. That has been the tragedy and the mercy of my whole life. So I just handed her up onto the seat and climbed up beside her and clucked the team into the long, dry road out toward the Rafter Sea, and for a good 3 miles neither of us said a thing but the wagon. The land out there does its own talking if you let it. That afternoon it said heat and creosote and the far blue teeth of the mountains and a hawk hung up on the wind like a nail in the sky. Della, I didn't call her Della yet, wouldn't for weeks, sat straight-backed and watched it go by. Once she reached up and touched her own glove, pressed her thumb against the palm of it like she was checking for something, and then folded her hands again. "It's not what I pictured," she said finally. "Better or worse?" She considered that honestly, which I was coming to see was just how she did everything. "Emptier," she said. "There's nowhere here to hide." "No, ma'am, there surely isn't." She almost smiled. It didn't get all the way to her mouth, but it got close, and I marked that the way I mark a first drop of rain, a thing to watch. Here is what I have decided in the years since about that ride. I think she'd already made up her mind to be turned away, and had decided to be dignified about it. She had built a little house inside herself for the disappointment to live in, furnished it, gotten used to it. 2 men had done that to her. I never learned their names, and I never wanted to. One had looked at her on a station platform in Ohio and said, loud enough for the porters to hear, that he'd not have people think he married a fence post. The other had been kinder in the coward's way, had taken her to a hotel, bought her a meal, and left a note under her door before dawn with money in it and no explanation because he couldn't be bothered to be cruel to her face. I don't know which was worse. She never said. But she came west anyway, a 3rd time, because she was out of money and out of family, and I suspect, because a part of her that she couldn't kill still believed she was owed one true thing. We came over the last rise near sundown, and there was the Rafter Sea laid out in the draw, the low house, the barn, the corrals, the cottonwoods along the seep where the water came up green in all that brown. And there was a figure by the corral gate, and he'd been standing there long enough that his shadow ran out 20 feet behind him. We's had washed. He'd washed and shaved and put on his good shirt and combed his hair with water so it lay down wrong, sticking up in back where he couldn't see it. And he was standing at the gate the way a man stands when he's been standing a long while and won't let himself sit. When he saw the wagon, he came forward, and he came forward with his limp, the leg that hadn't set clean after the stampede that took his father, the leg the town liked to talk about. He didn't try to hide it. He never did. That was the thing about Wheeze that took me the longest to understand and the deepest to love. He had made his peace with being looked at, and so he had a gentleness toward anyone else who got looked at too. He came up to the wagon and he looked up at Adelaide Voss, all the way up, and I braced for it. I braced for the flinch. I had seen it on the platform in my mind 100 times before we ever reached the ranch. I knew how a man's face changes when the picture and the person don't match, when the thing he feared is standing there taller than him in the gold light. Wee's face changed all right. It opened. I have no better word. It opened like a door in winter when someone you'd given up on knocks. He smiled, not the polite smile, not the salesman's smile, but the one that came up from somewhere under his ribs and pulled his whole tired face along with it. And he took his hat off and held it against his chest and said, "Miss Voss, you came." 2 words, you came, like it was the marvel of the age, like he was the one who'd been afraid of being turned away. I heard her breathe in. I was close enough to hear it, a sharp, small pull of air, the kind you make when cold water hits a burn, or when a thing you'd stopped hoping for arrives after all, and your body doesn't know what to do with it. Her gloved hands were locked together in her lap, white at the knuckle. She looked down at him, and for a moment she couldn't speak at all, and I watched the little house she'd built inside herself for the disappointment just stand there empty, with nobody moving in. "Ah, yes," she managed. "I did. I'm sorry I wasn't at the depot." He was still holding his hat, still looking up at her like she was whether he'd prayed for. "Cow trouble. Josiah'll tell you it's the truth. I'm not the kind to lie about a thing like that. I wouldn't." He stopped himself, swallowed, started over slower. "I'm real glad you're here. I wasn't sure you'd come. I wrote a thing in my last letter. I don't know if it was the right thing." "It was," she said, fast, before he could take it back. "It was the right thing." and she reached down into the lining of her glove and drew out a scrap of paper worn soft as cloth, and she held it a moment before she put it away again, and I saw 3 words on it in Wee's careful, thrice-copied hand. I only got the once glance, but I have thought about those 3 words every day since, and I'll set them down here so you know what a man can say without saying much at all, if he means it all the way to the bone. Come as you are. That's all it said, come as you are. She'd carried it 2,000 miles. We's helped her down from the wagon. He had to reach up to do it, and it should have been comical. This shorter man handing down a taller woman, and maybe to somebody watching from the road it was. But there wasn't anybody watching from the road except me and the hawk and God, and none of us laughed. She came down and stood beside him in the last of the light, and she didn't stoop. That's the thing I want you to see. She stood up to her full height for maybe the first time in years, right there in the dust of the rafter sea, and Wees Cade tipped his head back to look her in the eye and grinned like it was the finest view in the territory. "You're tall," he said, wonderingly, like it was a gift she'd brought him. "I am," she said, her voice cracked right down the middle of it. "I've been told." "Good," we said. "The high shelf in the kitchen's been useless to me for years. My father built it for himself, and he was a long-boned man, and I never could reach the—" He stopped, because she'd made a sound, and it was halfway between a laugh and a sob, and neither of them knew which way it would fall. It fell to laughing. Thank God it fell to laughing. I unhitched the team and gave them their heads at the trough and stayed out by the barn longer than I needed to, because some moments a man ought not to stand in the middle of. Through the kitchen window I could see them, Della sitting at the table with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking, and We's across from her talking with his hands the way he did when he was nervous, and both of them careful as 2 people handling something that might break. I heard her laugh again once. I heard him go quiet a long while, the way he did before he said a true thing. I got out my tally book by the barn lantern. I meant to write down the heifer and the calf, which was the day's real news, a good bull calf out of a first-time mother, worth marking. I wrote it down. And then under it, in the column where I keep the weather, I wrote something I have never written before or since about a human being. Aug 14, 1 heifer cast saved. 1 bull calf live, 1 bride arrived, not sent back. I looked at that last line a long time in the lantern light. I did not yet know about Harlan Boyd, whose fences ran up against our east range, and whose eyes ran up against everything the cads had that he wanted. I did not yet know that in 3 weeks' time a count would come up short, and a lie would find a family to land on, and that this tall, gentle woman who'd spent her whole life being made small would have to decide, in front of a crowd of armed men, whether to make herself small one more time or stand up to her full and terrible height and refuse. I did not know any of that. That night I only knew the heifer was saved and the calf was live and the bride had not been sent back, and that Wees Cade, who the whole town had written off as a broken-legged bachelor who'd die alone out here in the draw, was sitting at his own table watching a woman laugh and looking like the sun had finally decided to rise. I closed the book. I banked the lantern. Some things you don't get to write down. You just get to have been there. There is a thing that happens on a ranch in the weeks after a marriage, and it is the opposite of what the town expects. The town expects fireworks or ruin. What actually happens is smaller and stranger and harder to explain to anyone who hasn't lived it. 2 strangers learn the sound of each other's boots on the porch. That was the autumn of it. I'll try to set it down plain. Della and Wees were married 11 days after she came off the train. They did it quiet in the front room with a circuit preacher who happened through and me and old Consulo who cooked for us standing up as witnesses. Della wore the gray dress. She'd have worn something finer if she'd owned it, but she didn't, and Wees told her, I heard him say it, through the wall the night before, that he liked the gray, that it was the color she'd been wearing when she stepped off the train and looked at him like she was daring him to be a disappointment. "I want to marry the woman who dared me," he said. And Della was quiet a long time, and then I heard her cross the room, and I got up and went out to the barn because a man ought to know when a wall has heard enough. She settled into the place the way water settles into dry ground, slow at first, then all at once, then like it had always been there. Within a month, she'd reorganized the kitchen, doctored a foundered mare I'd given up on, and reached down every last thing off Wees' father's high shelf. She kept the ledgers better than I did, and I'd kept them 20 years. She had a head for figures that made me feel like a schoolboy holding a slate upside down. And she had a quirk of her own, which I loved her for once I understood it. When she was thinking hard, she'd stand at her full height and square her shoulders, deliberate, like she was practicing not folding. She'd spent so long making herself small that standing straight was a thing she had to choose, every time, a little act of defiance against 2,000 miles of men who taught her to stoop. I never told her I noticed. Some things you honor best by keeping quiet. It was Della who first met Clahan properly, and that meeting is the hinge the whole rest of this turns on, so let me tell it right. Our east range buted up against the foothills, and up in those foothills, in a fold of ground with a spring the territory maps didn't bother to show, lived Clahan and his wife Tawny and their people. A small band, maybe 30 souls, who had not gone to the reservation and had not gone to war and had instead done the hardest thing of all, which is stay put and be left alone. We's father had made an arrangement with them years back, in the plain-dealing way of the old ranchers who understood that a spring in the hills was worth more than a fight. The Cade cattle could water at the lower seep, the band could take a beef from the Cade herd twice a year in the lean times, and neither man would ever pretend the other wasn't there. It wasn't friendship exactly. It was something rarer. It was two people who decided the country was big enough. We had kept the arrangement after his father died. I'd worried over it, I'll be honest. I was a fearful man in those days. I'd been raised on the ugly stories, and it takes a long time to unlearn a fear you were fed as a child. But we's had a way of looking at a thing straight. Clahan's kept his word longer than any white man I ever dealt with, he told me once. Boyd shorted me on a horse deal in the spring and shook my hand while he did it. I'll take the man who keeps his word. And that was the end of the argument because it was true. The morning Della met Clahan, she was out at the seep looking at the water. She was always looking at the water. She'd come from a wet country and the dryness fascinated and grieved her. And Clahan came down off the hill leading a horse that had gone lame. He hadn't expected her. I don't imagine either of them expected the other. He was a lean, weathered man of maybe 50 with a face like the country itself. And here was this tall woman in gray standing at the seep, and they looked at each other across the water a long moment. I was up on the ridge with the glasses, and I confess my heart went into my throat, because I didn't yet know Della and I didn't know what she'd do. I'd seen women scream at less. I'd seen men reach for a rifle at less. Della looked at the lame horse. Then she looked at Clahan, and she did the thing that told me more than anything else in those first weeks, exactly what kind of person had come off that train. She pointed at the horse's near foreleg. She'd seen the trouble before he'd said a word, and she made a small gesture, a question, may I? And when Clahan, after a moment, gave the smallest nod, she waded straight across the seep in her boots, ruined them, didn't care, and knelt down in the mud and took that horse's leg up in her hands like she'd been doing it all her life. She found the stone bruise. She showed it to him. She dug in her apron pocket and came out with the little knife she used for everything, and she pared the sole down careful, talking low to the horse the whole while in a voice I couldn't hear, and she got the pressure off it. And when she stood up, the horse put weight on the foot, and Clahan watched all of this with a face that didn't change, but eyes that did. He said something to her in his own tongue. She didn't understand it. But she understood the tone, and she nodded, and she wiped her hands on her ruined apron, and that was that. Tawny brought her a pair of moccasins 2 weeks later, left them on the porch rail without a word, soft and beautiful and exactly the length of Della's long foot. She'd sized them just by looking, the way Della had sized the horse's trouble just by looking. Two women who saw things quick, meeting across a language and a fear and a whole bloody history, and deciding, quietly, to see each other instead. I put it in the tally book, except one horse doctored, not ours, one pair moccasins given, not asked. I didn't have a column for what it meant. I still don't. Now I have to tell you about Harlan Boyd, and I'll try to be fair to him, though it costs me. Boyd ran the Circle B on our east side, and he was not a stupid man, which was the trouble. A stupid man you can steer around. Boyd was patient, and he was smiling, and he wanted the seep. He wanted the water in the hills, and he wanted the low ground it fed, and standing between him and it were two things he considered obstacles rather than people. A broken-legged cowman he'd already decided was weak, and a band of Apache he was certain no court in the territory would ever count as neighbors. Boyd had done the arithmetic. He'd figured a way to take the water and blame the taking on the people he could most easily see hanged for it. It started with the count. We gathered the herd for the fall tally the 3rd week of September, and we came up 41 head short. 41. I counted twice and Della counted once, and we all got the same wrong number. Now, cattle wander, cattle die, cattle get into a wash and break their necks, and a shortfall isn't proof of anything by itself. But 41 is a lot of neck-breaking. And within a day, the story was already loose in Wilcox. I heard it from the freighter that the cads were losing beef to the bunch up in the hills. And wasn't it a shame? And wasn't it about time somebody did something about that spring nobody was using proper? Boyd had planted it. I knew it the way you know weather. But knowing a thing and proving it are two different animals. And Boyd had built his lie careful, on the back of a fear the whole territory already carried. Which is the most dangerous kind of lie there is, the kind that doesn't have to convince anybody because they already believed it before you spoke. Weez went white when he heard the shape of it. Not angry white, scared white, because he understood quicker than I did where it was headed. He's not after the cattle, we said. We were standing in the barn and he had a bridle in his hands and he was working the leather without seeing it. The cattle's just the match. He wants the town riled up enough to ride on Clahan's people, and when they're gone, when they're dead or run off, the seep's got nobody on it and Boyd's the nearest water rights, and he takes it clean and calls it justice. He set the bridle down. It's a good plan, Josiah. God help me, it's a good plan. I can't see the hole in it. Della had come in behind us. She stood in the barn door with the light behind her tall, and I watched her square her shoulders, that little private act of standing straight, and she said, in that low, even practiced voice, "The hole in it is the count." We looked at her. 41 head don't vanish, she said. They're somewhere. Boyd didn't kill them, that's waste, and Boyd doesn't waste. He drove them off and he's holding them because he'll need to produce them or their hides at the right moment to prove the theft when the town's ready to move. A liar keeps his evidence close. She came into the barn. Find the cattle and you've got the lie by the throat. They'll be on Circle B ground, back in some canyon, wearing worked-over brands or none at all. And they'll be guarded because 41 head is money and Boyd's a careful man. She looked at Weez. But you can't go looking. If a cade's caught on Circle B ground, that's the trespass Boyd wants. That's him the victim and you the thief, and it all runs the other way. I have never in my life seen a mind work like that. Weez hadn't either. He was looking at her like she'd pulled the sun down off the shelf. Then who goes looking? He said slowly. And that was the moment. That was the morally heavy thing, the choice that this whole story had been walking toward since the train pulled out of the station. And I want to lay it out honest because there was no clean answer in it. And anyone who tells you there is lying to you the way Boyd lied. Because the person who could find those cattle, who could move over that ground unseen, who knew every canyon and every fold of the Circle B better than Boyd did himself, who could track 41 head over rock, was Clahan. And to ask Clahan to go was to ask him to risk the one thing his people had bought so dearly, their invisibility, their being left alone. If Clahan or any of his men were caught on Boyd's ground for any reason, true or false, Boyd would have his hanging and his war and his water, and the truth wouldn't matter one damn bit. We'd be asking a man to save us by walking into the exact trap that was laid for him. Weez knew it, Della knew it. Nobody said it out loud for a long minute in that barn, and the not saying was the loudest thing I ever heard. We can't ask him, we said finally, quiet. It's not ours to ask, he's got 30 people up there, I won't spend them to save my cattle. I know, Della said. There's got to be another way. There isn't. Not one that works in time. She said it gently, but she said it because she was a woman who'd learned the hard way that pretending a hard truth is soft doesn't make it soft, it just makes you unready for it. The town's already talking. Boyd sets the pace now. We've got days, not weeks. We's put his hands over his face. His father's leg, the leg that took his father, the stampede, I think he was thinking about his father, about the arrangement his father had made in good faith, about how it fell to him now to either honor it or spend it. Then we do nothing, he said into his hands. We take the loss, 41 head, we eat it and we ride out the talk and we don't put those people in Boyd's gun sights to save my beef. I'd rather lose the ranch. And he meant it. That's the thing I need you to understand about Weez Cade. He meant it all the way down. He'd rather have lost the Rafter Sea, the place his family bled for, than spend one Apache life to keep it. It was the finest thing I ever heard a man say, and it was also, we all three knew, not a plan. It was a good man choosing to lose. Boyd would take the water either way. We's doing nothing didn't save Clahan's people. It just meant they'd be attacked over a slower lie instead of a faster one. There was no clean way out. That was the trap's true cruelty. Every road ran through somebody's ruin. It was Della who broke the silence, and what she said changed the shape of everything. And I've thought since that only she could have said it, because only she had spent her whole life on the receiving end of other people deciding what was best for her. "You're both leaving somebody out of the choosing," she said. We looked at her. "Clahan," she said his name careful, the way you say a name you've decided to respect. "You're sitting here deciding what he's allowed to risk, deciding it's too dangerous for him, that you won't spend him like he's yours to spend or not spend." She wasn't angry, but there was iron under it. "Wheeze, when the notice went in that paper, when you were deciding whether to write to me, did you decide for me what I could stand? Did you decide a tall woman couldn't bear the trip, so you'd spare me the asking?" Wheeze went still. "No," Della said. "You wrote 3 words and you let me choose. Come as you are. You let me be the one to decide if I could bear it. That's the only decent thing anybody ever did for me, and it's the reason I'm standing in this barn." She squared her shoulders. "So you'll do Clahan the same decency. You'll tell him the whole truth, all of it, the trap, the risk, what it costs if he's caught. And then you'll shut your mouth and let a grown man decide his own danger. It's not respect to choose his risks for him. It's just the old thing wearing a kind face. It's deciding, one more time, that some people don't get to sit at the table where their own life is bargained over." The barn was dead quiet. I have kept a tally book 31 years, and I have written down a great many things that were true. But I never wrote down a truer one than what that tall bride said in the barn that afternoon, and I couldn't fit it in any column, so I've kept it in my head instead, where it's worn smooth as the paper she carried across the country. Wheeze was crying, not making a sound about it, but crying, the tears just running down into his collar, because I think he'd spent his whole life being decided for by a town that saw a limp before it saw a man, and he'd just heard the woman he married name the exact shape of the cage, and then hand him the key by asking him to unlock somebody else's. "All right," he said when he could. "All right, we ask him honest, and we let him answer." So we rode up into the hills the next morning, the 3 of us in the open, in daylight, because Della said if we were going to do a straight thing, we'd do it in the sun. Clahan met us at the edge of the trees with 2 of his young men and Tawny standing back a little, and we got down off his horse, got down careful, the leg, and he stood in front of Clahan and he told him everything. He told it all, the count, the lie, Boyd's plan and how it ran, the whole ugly machine of it, and how the cattle were surely on Circle B ground, and how finding them would break the lie, and how the only man who could find them was standing in front of him, and how doing it might cost Clahan's people everything they'd stayed alive to keep. He didn't soften any of it. He didn't make it sound heroic. He made it sound exactly as dangerous as it was, and then he did the hardest thing, which was stop talking. "I won't ask you to do it," we said. "I won't even ask. I came to tell you the truth of what's coming for you, whatever you decide, because it's coming for you either way now, and you've a right to know it. That's all. What you do about it is yours." Della translated where she could, with her hands and the few words she'd gathered, and Tawny filled the rest, and Clahan stood there in the pines and listened to the whole of it, and his face did not change, and his eyes did. When Wheeze was done, Clahan was quiet a long while. The wind moved in the trees. Somewhere below us a cow called, and another answered. Then Clahan said something, and Tawny turned it into English for us, slow, choosing each word. "He says the cattle are in the 3rd canyon behind the Red Rock, on Boyd's ground, 40-1. A pause. He says. He counted them 8 days ago, when they were driven up. He has known where your cattle are since before you knew they were gone." We stood there stunned. "He says," Tawny went on, and here her voice changed, and I saw her look at her husband, "he did not tell you, because he did not know if you would use the truth to save his people or to save only your cattle and let the lie fall on him after. He says a man learns to wait and see which kind of white man he is dealing with." She stopped, started again. "He says today he has seen. You came in the sun and you told the whole truth and you let him choose, so now he chooses." Clahan looked at Wheeze and then longer at Della. "He says he will guide you to the 3rd canyon, not because you asked. Because you did not. I've turned that over 1,000 nights since. Not because you asked, because you did not. There's a whole philosophy of how to treat a human being folded up in that sentence, and I was 50 years old before a tall bride and an Apache man taught it to me in a stand of pines above a stolen herd. We had the lie by the throat. We knew where the cattle were. We had a witness who'd seen them driven, and a plan taking shape to bring the truth into Wilcox in a way Boyd couldn't twist. But knowing where a thing is and taking it back are 2 different animals, like I said. Boyd had those 41 head guarded in a canyon on his own ground, and Boyd was a careful man, and Boyd had the whole territory's oldest fear standing ready to do his fighting for him. And there was a piece of it none of us had said out loud yet, though I think Della had seen it from the start, the way she saw the stone bruise before the horse limped. To break the lie in the open in front of the town, somebody was going to have to stand up in Wilcox and tell a crowd of frightened armed men that everything they wanted to believe was false. Somebody was going to have to make themselves a target on purpose, in the sun, at their full height, and dare the whole territory to be a disappointment. We all knew who that somebody would be. She was already squaring her shoulders. I have been asked in the years since whether I was afraid that day in Wilcox. The honest answer is that I was so afraid I'd stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a sound that's gone on too long. Fear becomes weather. You just live inside it. But I'm getting ahead. Let me set the ground first, because the ground is the whole thing. We had 3 days. That was Della's read, and Della's reads were right. Boyd had the town half-lit already. The talk in Wilcox had gone from shame about the cad's losses to somebody ought to ride up in those hills in the space of a week. And the men who said it loudest were men who owed Boyd money or wanted his favor. He was going to move on a Saturday, we figured, when the town was full and drunk and easy to steer. He'd produce the evidence, some of the stolen beef, brands worked over to look like a clumsy Apache theft, and he'd let the crowd's own fear carry the rest. He wouldn't have to fire a shot himself. That was the beauty of his machine. It ran on other men's terror and left his hands clean. So the plan had to do 2 things at once, and do them in daylight in front of witnesses, or it was worth nothing. It had to prove the cattle were on Circle B ground, driven there and hidden, not strayed, not stolen by the hills, but rustled by Boyd himself. And it had to do it in a way that put the truth in front of the whole town at once, before Boyd could get his story moving, because a lie that gets a head start is nearly impossible to catch. Here is what we did. I'll tell it plain because it deserves plain telling. Clahan and 2 of his young men went in the night before, not to take the cattle. Della was firm on that. Taking them was the trespass Boyd wanted, but to witness. To fix in their own eyes and be ready to swear where the herd stood, on whose ground, wearing whose worked-over brands. And to leave one thing behind that Della had thought of, which was the small genius of the whole business. Boyd's men, the ones guarding the canyon, kept a fire and a coffee pot and a running tally scratched on a board. How many head, checked morning and night, the way any careful outfit counts stock it means to move. Boyd was careful, remember. That was his strength, and Della turned it into the thing that broke him. Because a man who keeps a tally board on stolen cattle has, in his own hand, written the proof of his own crime. Clahan's men didn't fight the guards. They didn't need to. They watched, and near dawn, when the guards were dozing, they lifted that tally board clean off its nail and were gone into the rocks before the coffee was cold. And by the time the sun was up, the board was in Della's hands at our kitchen table. Boyd's own foreman's writing, 41 head, dated, tallied morning and night for 11 days, on a board that anyone in Wilcox could see had been guarding cattle in a canyon that everybody knew sat squarely on Circle B ground. Della laid it on the table and looked at it a long while. "It's not enough," she said. We's looked up. "It's his own hand. It's his foreman's hand, and Boyd'll swear he never saw it, that the foreman acted alone, that it's forged, that we stole it, which we did." She said it flat. "A board proves cattle were counted. It doesn't prove they're yours, and it doesn't put Boyd on the ground giving the order. He'll wriggle. Careful men always leave themselves a door." She squared her shoulders, thinking. "We need Boyd to say it, in front of the town. We need him to reach for the lie in the open, with his own mouth, where they can all hear the reaching. How do you make a careful man do that?" Della looked at him, and then she looked at me. And there was something in her face I'd only seen once before. On the train platform, the morning she stepped down all at once into cold water before her nerve could fail. "You give him a target he can't stand to leave alone," she said. I fought her on it. "I'll set that down, because I don't want anyone thinking I was brave. I was not brave. Della was brave, and I was the frightened old man who tried to talk her out of being brave, which is a thing I have to live with and have made my peace with only in the way you make peace with a scar. The plan was this. Della would go into Wilcox on Saturday, the busy day, and she would stand up in the middle of the street in front of the whole town, at her full height, and she would call Harlan Boyd a cattle thief to his face. She would show the tally board, She would name the canyon. And she would do it in a way calculated to enrage him. Not to reason with him, reason was useless, but to provoke him, to make him lose the careful patience that was his whole armor. Because a careful man who loses his temper in front of a crowd will reach for the fastest lie he's got. And the fastest lie is always the ugliest. And the ugliest lie is the one about the hills. And the moment he reached for that, the moment he said in front of the whole town, it was the Apache. Everyone knows it was the Apache. Clahan and his men would step out of the crowd where they'd been standing in plain sight all along, and the lie would have nowhere to land. That was the whole thing. Make Boyd say the lie out loud in the open, and have the truth standing right there to catch it. But it turned on Della making herself a target. On her walking into the middle of a street full of frightened armed men and drawing every eye, which meant drawing every gun, and standing there at the full and terrible height she'd spent her whole life trying to hide, and refusing, in front of all of them, to fold. "There's 100 ways it goes wrong," I told her the night before. We were in the barn. I'd gone out to check the mare, and she'd followed me, and I think she'd followed me on purpose because she knew I was the one who'd argue, and she wanted the argument done before Weeze could hear it. Boyd's men are armed. The crowd's scared. Somebody gets spooked, somebody fires, and you're the tallest thing in the street, Della. You're the first thing anybody sees. I know. Then let me do it. Let Weeze do it. Let it be a man they expect to make noise. That's exactly why it can't be you, she said it gently. She was always gentle when she was being immovable. That was one of the ways you knew she'd decided. If a man stands up and accuses Boyd, it's two men fighting over cattle and the town picks a side and it's a brawl. But if I stand up, she stopped. Chose her words the way Tawny chose them, careful, each one paid for. They've spent a week being told there's a danger in the hills, a savage danger, a thing to be feared. And then a woman stands up in the street, a woman they can see isn't dangerous, a woman who's clearly no rustler, a bride, a wife, and she says no, the danger's not in the hills, the danger's standing right here in a clean shirt, smiling at you. That's a thing they have to look at, Josiah. It stops them. It makes them think for 1 second instead of feel, and 1 second's thinking is all we need for Boyd to lose his temper. She squared her shoulders in the lantern light. And there's the other thing. The thing I won't say to Weeze because it'll break his heart, but I'll say to you because you'll keep it. Della, my whole life, she said, men have looked at me and decided what I was before I opened my mouth. Too tall, too much. A fence post, a thing to be ashamed of, a woman to leave a note for and sneak out on before dawn. Her voice didn't shake. She'd practiced it not shaking for 30 years, and it held. I have spent every day of my life being made small by people who never once had to be brave to do it. And now, for the first time, the very thing they hated me for, that I'm tall, that I can't hide, that when I stand up straight the whole street has to see me, that's the weapon. That's the thing that saves those people in the hills. Do you understand what that is to me? To finally once be too much for a good reason? She looked at me, and there were tears standing in her eyes, but not one of them fell. I've been getting ready for this street my whole life. I just didn't know that's what all the folding was training me for. I am the only person in the territory who could walk into that street and not be able to hide. Let me be the one thing I never got to be. Let me be exactly my full size on purpose where it matters. I did not have the words. I have told you that about myself, and it was never truer than in that barn. So I said the only true thing I had. I'll be behind you, I said. In the crowd, with a rifle I hope to God I don't have to use. I know you will, she said. That's why I let you argue. I needed you angry enough to come. Saturday came up hot and hard and blue. Wilcox on a Saturday in those days was a full street, freighters and cowhands and store men and the whole raw population of a territory town on its one loud day. Boyd was there. Of course he was there. It was his day, his stage. He'd built the whole thing for this. He was standing in front of the mercantile with 4 of his men and half the town gathered loose around him. And he was already talking. I caught the tail of it as we came up the street, the smooth, patient poison of it. A man hates to say it, but a man's got to protect his stock. And everybody knows what's been coming down out of those hills. And the crowd was making the low, ugly sound a crowd makes when it's being handed permission to do a thing it already wanted to do. Della walked up the middle of the street. I want you to see it the way I saw it, from behind and to the side, my hand sweating on the rifle under my coat. She walked up the middle of the street in the gray dress, the same gray she'd stepped off the train in, and she did not stoop. She'd spent 30 years learning to fold, and she unfolded every inch of it, all at once. and she walked up that street at her full height with the tally board in her 2 hands. And one by one the men in the crowd stopped talking and turned to look at her, because she was the tallest thing in the street and the stillest, and she was walking straight at Harlan Boyd like the finger of God. Boyd stopped mid-sentence. "Harlan Boyd," Della said, her voice carried. She'd practiced that too, I found out later, practiced pitching it to fill a room alone in the kitchen because she'd known this day was coming and she'd meant to be ready. "You're a cattle thief. You drove 41 head of rafter sea beef into the 3rd Canyon behind the Red Rock on your own ground 11 days ago. Your men have been counting them morning and night." She held up the board. "This is your foreman's hand, 40-1, dated, every day. You've been fattening my husband's stolen cattle on your own grass, while you told this town the Apache took them." The street went dead silent. I watched Boyd's face, and I watched him do the arithmetic fast, the way a careful man does, and I watched him find the door he always kept and reach for it, exactly as Della had known he would, because his patience was his armor and she'd walked straight through it by making him a fool in front of the town he ruled. "That board's a forgery," Boyd said, loud, reaching. "That woman stole it or made it, doesn't matter. You all know what she is, married into that outfit that's been running with the Hill Bunch for years. You want to know where your safety went?" He flung his arm up toward the mountains, and his voice climbed, and there was the reach, the fast, ugly lie coming out of him in the open with his own mouth in front of the whole street. "It's them. It's always been them. The cads brought the savages down on all of us, and now they send a—" "Say the rest, Harlan." Della hadn't moved. She stood at her full height in the middle of the street, and she looked down at him. She had to look down at him. She was taller than him, and I have never seen a thing so quiet and so total. And she said it again, soft now, so the whole silent street had to lean in to catch it. "Say the rest. Tell them it was the Apache. Say it plain, point at the hills and swear to it." And Boyd, red-faced, cornered, his careful patience gone to ash, pointed at the mountains and shouted, "It was the Apache. Everyone here knows it was the Apache they've been thieving off this valley for." Clahan stepped out of the crowd. He'd been there the whole time. He and his 2 young men, standing in plain sight in the Saturday crowd where nobody had thought to look, because nobody looks at what they're afraid of until it's pointed out to them. He stepped out into the open street, into the sun. At the exact instant Boyd's arm was still up and pointing at the hills where Clahan was supposed to be. And he stood there and let the whole town see him. Not thieving, not raiding, not in the hills at all, but standing calm in their own street, having heard every word. And behind him came 2 of Clahan's young men, and one of them held up, for the town to see, the coffee pot and a guard's coat lifted from the canyon camp. The small human proof that men had been sitting on those cattle for 11 days. "He counted them the night they were driven," Della said into the silence, and now her voice broke just once, just at the edge, because I think even she hadn't been sure it would work until it worked. 8 days before we knew they were gone. He watched Boyd's own men drive Rafter C cattle onto Circle B ground. He's here to swear to it, in front of all of you, in the sun." Boyd's arm was still up, pointing at the empty hills, and every man in that street was looking from his pointing finger to the calm Apache man standing right there in front of them, and I watched the thing happen that Boyd's whole plan couldn't survive. I watched a crowd think. 1 second of thinking, exactly like Della said. And in that 1 second, the fear that Boyd had been stoking all week turned around in the street and looked at the man who'd been stoking it, and the crowd's low, ugly sound changed pitch, changed into something else, and Boyd heard it change, and he knew. He knew he'd lost. You could see the moment it reached him. I won't tell you it ended clean, because it didn't, and I promised myself years ago I'd never dress this story up. Boyd's men reached for iron. Of course they did. And there was a bad half-minute in that street where everything hung on the edge of the thing we'd all been most afraid of, and my rifle was out, and I'll not pretend my hands were steady. But a crowd that's just been made a fool of is an angry crowd, and it wasn't angry at the Apache anymore. And Boyd's 4 men looked at 40 townsmen who just realized they'd been played. And they did the arithmetic too, and they put their hands down. They took Boyd off to the territorial marshal that same afternoon. The tally board went with him, and Clahan swore his account through Tawny, who'd come down to translate and stood in that courthouse at her own full height, and it held. It held because the truth had gotten there first for once in the sun in front of everyone before the lie could get its head start. The cattle came home, 40-1. Boyd went away for a long time. The town was ashamed of itself for a while, in the way towns are, and then it mostly forgot to be in the way towns do. The arrangement with the Seep held. Tawny and Della went on trading things across the porch rail, moccasins, medicine, the small knowledge of two women who'd learned to see quick. Clahan and Wheeze never did become what you'd call friends, exactly. They became something rarer, like I said before. Two men who decided the country was big enough and who now had proof. I want to end with Della because it's her story, whatever the title says about the cowboy's smile. And that smile mattered, God knows. That smile on the platform was the door everything else walked through. But the story was always hers. That evening we came back out to the rafter sea, all of us wrung out and quiet the way you get after you've been afraid for a long time and survived it. And we's helped Della down from the wagon, reached up to do it. The shorter man handing down the taller woman, and it wasn't comical this time. It wasn't comical at all. And he held onto her hands a moment longer than the getting down needed, standing in the last gold light in the dust of the ranch. You walked up that whole street, he said. His voice wasn't steady. You walked up the whole street and you didn't stoop once. I watched you. I couldn't breathe, but I watched you. And Della, who had been made small her entire life by men who never had to be brave to do it, who had come west a third time out of money and out of family, and still, somehow, not out of that one thing she couldn't kill, Della looked down at her husband, all the way down, and she smiled. You told me to come as I was, she said. Turns out I was exactly the right size after all. I went out to the barn. Some moments a man ought not to stand in the middle of. I'd learned that the first night, and I hadn't unlearned it. I got out the tally book by the lantern. I meant to write down the cattle, 40 and 1, recovered home. That was the day's real news, the news the ledger keeps. I wrote it down, 41 head home. And under it, in the column where I keep the weather, in the space where I'd once written one bride, arrived, not sent back. I sat a long while with the pencil not moving, trying to find the size of what I'd seen, and I could not find it, because there is no column for a person becoming exactly herself in the middle of a street full of guns.